The light of 1951 arrived differently in the basement offices of the U.S. Geological Survey. It was filtered, bureaucratic, and cool, entering through windows set high above the sidewalk line, perpetually smelling of damp earth and aging paper. The only true warmth came from the low, constant hum of the fluorescent tubes overhead, a sound so ubiquitous it became the pulse of the American government's silent function. This sound, Elias Vance knew, was the true measure of peace. It was the sound of everything being exactly where it was supposed to be. Elias himself was a man defined by the absolute. His suit jackets were always pressed, his movements economical, and his thoughts arranged in perfect perpendicular lines like the grid he was paid to extend. He was a cartographer, a surveyor of the earth, and in a world recently saved by vast, terrifying, and abstract forces, Elias took refuge in the concrete poetry of measurement. He believed in the immutable truth of a degree, a minute, a second, the bedrock upon which true security was built. His favorite tool was the heavy, cool brass of the planer bar, a device that felt solid and honest in his hands, unlike the endless, vaporous memos that drifted down from the upper floors. He worked in a world of fine dust and graphite. The long drafting tables, scarred by decades of meticulous work, gave off the dry, slightly acidic scent of old wood and fresh blueprints. The sound was soft, the whisper of a T-square gliding across. Vellum, the almost inaudible click of a protractor settling onto a precise angle, and the constant rhythmic sharpening of his pencils. This routine was his shelter. Outside, America was gripped by a vibrant, nervous tension, the fear of the atom, the promise of the future, and the breathless speed of expansion. But down here, under the ground, under the weight of the city, only mathematical certainty held sway. It was a place where anxiety could not penetrate, because anxiety was imprecise. Elias's current assignment was a monumental task, yet deceptively dull. The final, definitive mapping of the burgeoning suburban corridor spilling out of Washington, D.C. So the new America was rising in carefully plotted ranch houses, manicured lawns, and cul-de-sacs named after trees that had been clear-cut to make room for them. His task was to take the raw field data, the transit readings, the chain measurements, the elevation studies, and translate them into the beautiful, authoritative language of the master map. This wasn't merely charting. This was codifying the American dream. He had been working on the Rock Creek sector for 3 weeks. This area was particularly new, a stretch of development characterized by identical split-level homes built by a firm called Patriot Crest Developments. They were perfect, square, solid, and aligned on streets that curved just enough to feel neighborly but not so much as to feel confusing. Elias traced the lines of the streets, confirming every angle, every property line, every water main connection. He drew the contours of the land, the subtle changes in elevation that defined the flow of water and the shape of the horizon. Microhook. Contradiction of the familiar. It was on a Tuesday, late in the afternoon, when the afternoon light was long and dusty. Elias was charting a seemingly insignificant shallow ridge that ran through the backyards of a dozen houses on Elm Street. The field notes, taken by his colleague David Hale, were meticulously marked. The gradient was clear, a gentle, 15-foot rise over 500 feet. Yet when Elias overlaid the initial photogrammetric data, the aerial photographs, and checked it against the established geodetic benchmarks, his own instruments seemed to resist. The number, mathematically, was supposed to be 15 feet. But the feel of the map, the geometry of the whole design suggested something else. It was an instability, a subtle dishonesty that he couldn't yet locate in the numbers, only in the sense of spatial wrongness. He pressed down harder with his compass, as if to force the truth out of the paper. This single ridge felt too deliberate, too placed. It was the first moment of deep psychological discomfort he'd experienced in 20 years of surveying. He was forced to ask a terrifying question. Could the earth itself be lying? Elias poured a cup of coffee from the communal urn, a strong, bitter old brew that tasted exactly like the federal government, and walked over to a stack of older maps dating back to the late 1940s. He was looking for a pattern, any pre-development feature that could account for this ridge. Drainage? A defunct railway line? A natural aquifer boundary? The older maps were sparse, showing nothing but dense woodland and a single forgotten dirt road. He returned to his desk, running his fingers along the vellum, feeling the raised texture of the ink. The discrepancy was less than 6 inches in elevation, an amount that any other cartographer would dismiss as negligible field error. But Elias had built his entire identity on the principle that 6 inches was an infinite distance when measuring the truth. He started working backward, plotting the coordinates of the ridge. He noticed that the vertices, the precise points where the slope began and ended, did not align with any natural geological feature, nor did they correspond to the property lines. They lined up with horrifying precision to the center points of the houses themselves. It was as if the houses were the cause of the topography, not merely built upon it. Psychological reveal, the erosion of trust, the quiet of the basement. Office began to feel oppressive, less like a refuge and more like a carefully sealed vault. Elias felt a faint, prickly heat at the back of his neck, the kind of silent adrenaline that comes not from an explosion, but from the sudden, cold realization of absolute control. The subtle inconsistency in the Rock Creek sector was not an error, it was a calculation. But what kind of calculation involves the geometry of a suburban home? It triggered the deep-seated American anxiety about what the government knew that the people did not. This wasn't just about a map. It was about the structure of reality being quietly manipulated beneath the feet of trusting families. The sheer audacity of the deception, hiding a secret in the most public, most ordinary setting imaginable, was intellectually stunning. Elias recalled a passing, half-whispered joke from the engineers upstairs. The only truly safe secret is the one you embed in plain sight. He dismissed it then as cynical humor. Now, staring at the ghost contour on the Rock Creek map, the joke felt like a cold, official directive. He started to look at the other new developments built by Patriot Crest. There it was again. The same inexplicable, mathematically precise, slight elevation increase running directly under the central hall and utility closets of the houses. Not random, not natural, but systemic. He needed to confirm the field notes directly with David Hale, the colleague whose measurements he was using. David was a good man, meticulous, and one of the few people Elias still trusted in the swirling, silent currents of D.C. bureaucracy. He found David at his own desk, meticulously sharpening a handful of pencils to a lethal point. The scent of cedar was strong. Elias presented the section of the map, pointing to the 2 points where the elevation seemed to defy physics. David, without looking up from his sharpening, traced the line with his own fingertip. "Ah, yes, Elias. The little hiccup. Just a slight error in the transit leveling. Nothing to worry about. I've already corrected the preliminary digital transfer." He offered a placid, dismissive smile. A 6-inch error, corrected, with no note, no flag, no mention in the raw data. It was the absolute, perfect confidence of David's lie that chilled Elias to the core, far more than the ghost line itself. David hadn't made an error. He had covered one. The realization settled heavily. The system wasn't just hiding information in the suburbs, it was actively recruiting people to erase the evidence. The humming of the fluorescent light suddenly seemed louder, heavier, and less like the sound of peace. It was the sound of a monitoring system, always on, always watching. Elias took his map back, his movements slow and deliberate, protecting the fragile paper truth. He did not confront David, for confrontation would merely confirm his own knowledge. He only said, "Thank you, David. I'll make a note of the correction." But the note he made was not on the map. It was an indelible, fearful entry into his private mental ledger. Seamless retention bridge, soft cliffhanger. The question remained, what was powerful enough to require the meticulous construction of a false surface across a massive suburban tract? Elias knew the answer couldn't be found in the heights and depressions of the land itself. The line he traced on the map was technically correct according to the final logs, but geographically impossible based on his own reading. The physical line was a lie, and the key to its existence could only be a terrifying whisper buried in a forgotten, non-classified archive from the moment the Cold War began. He was already drafting a research request in his mind, targeting the early dark years of the atomic age, searching for a file code he had once dismissed as a dry geological study. It was called Project Cypress Point. Elias returned to his work, but the rhythm was broken. The peaceful hum of the fluorescence now feeling like a high-tension wire stretched taut across the room. He continued the meticulous tracing of the map, his mind now operating on 2 parallel tracks. The official, precise track of the U.S. Geological Survey, and the secret, jagged track of the true map that existed only in his head. Every correct line he drew felt like a betrayal of the truth he had just glimpsed. The paper was clean, but the reality was dirty. He spent the rest of the evening cross-referencing the field notes for the entire Rock Creek sector. He wasn't looking for errors anymore. He was looking for signatures. What else had David Hale marked as negligible? What other small, dismissible anomaly had been quietly corrected out of existence? He found a recurring instance of slight magnetic interference noted in the original magnetometer readings. A spike recorded at precisely the same central coordinates where the elevation hiccup occurred. Magnetic interference in a quiet residential area, strong enough to register on the instruments, yet filed away as local electrical noise. It was another piece of the infrastructure hidden in the noise of modern life. The sensation of dread was not sudden or dramatic. It was cumulative, like a slow, steady change in barometric pressure before a massive storm. It was the crushing weight of knowing that the very foundation of his life's work, the idea that science and measurement provided an objective truth, was a convenient fiction upheld by silence. The map, the grand symbol of American order and mastery over nature, was now revealed as a perfect, sophisticated lie. This level of coordination, the calculated effort to falsify topography across miles of real estate, suggested a resource beyond mere engineering. It suggested a power that demanded absolute obedience, the kind of power born in the blinding flash of the first atomic tests, micro-hook, sensory detail, and physical proof. Elias packed his heavy leather briefcase. He made sure to include not the final official map, but the original photogrammetric plates, the dense, cool glass negatives that captured the light of 1951 before the human hand could intervene. These plates were objective and stubborn. They recorded the light bouncing off the land, and the light, Elias reasoned, could not be forced to lie. He slipped them into a canvas folder, the weight of the glass feeling heavy and reassuring, a physical counterweight to the vaporous conspiracy taking shape in the suburbs. As he left the building, the lock clicking shut behind him was the loudest sound in the empty hall, a sound that suddenly felt less like security and more like final enclosure. He was now officially taking the problem outside the system. He drove home through the very suburbs he had been mapping. The Rock Creek sector, which had previously looked like a hopeful tableau of post-war prosperity, now felt like a stage set. Every ranch home, every perfectly planted shrub, every aluminum siding panel seemed to be performing a role in an immense, silent play. He slowed down as he drove past Elm Street, past the house at the epicenter of the anomaly. It was quiet. A light was on in the living room. A child's bicycle lay on its side in the driveway. The scene was heartbreakingly ordinary, and the sheer ordinariness of it was the conspiracy's most potent defense. How do you tell the world that the quiet house where children sleep is sitting atop a complex lie? You cannot. The truth would sound like madness. The deeper Elias plunged into his obsession, the more precise his mind became, mirroring the very grid that was betraying him. He began to apply the principles of surveying to human behavior. He started observing David Hale not as a colleague, but as a control point, a fixed element in the conspiracy's geometry. David's smile, his quick dismissal, the angle of his head when he spoke, Elias measured them all. He realized David wasn't scared. David was simply obedient. This was not a conspiracy of villains, but of functionaries, each performing a small, precise task in the overall deception. This fact was more terrifying than any secret document, because it meant the whole system was silently complicit. Psychological reveal, obsession, and the cartographer's burden. Elias had a recurring, quiet thought. He who draws the map controls the territory. But if the territory was designed to defy the map, then the control was absolute and utterly invisible. His profession, his identity, was fundamentally undermined. The psychological burden of the cartographer is the absolute need for truth. The ability to state with final authority, this is where the line is. By accepting the forced correction, David Hale had surrendered his authority. Elias Vance could not. His obsession was fueled not by adrenaline, but by a cold intellectual necessity to restore the integrity of measurement itself. This wasn't just a government secret. It was a philosophical crisis dressed up in suburban real estate. The thought was heavy, slow, and consuming, like a deep current dragging him away from the safe shore of official reality. He understood then that the real project was not about mapping, but about compliance. He had to find the source. He had to understand the language of the lie, the magnetic spikes, the ghost elevation, the custom housing developer. They all pointed to a specific suppressed era of research, an era when the American government, under the shadow of the bomb, sanctioned research that blurred the line between science and secrecy, and between architecture and psychological infrastructure. The anomaly wasn't just topographical, it was temporal. The origins of the lie lay just beyond the reach of public memory, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. He pulled his car to the curb a safe distance from his own home. Before he stepped out, he opened his briefcase and touched the cold glass of the photogrammetric plates. He knew he could not present this evidence to his superiors. It was too subtle, too mathematically precise, and too perfectly neutralized by the official record. David Hale had already done the work of discrediting any potential finding. Elias had to find the source of the cover-up, the genesis of Project Cypress Point, before they finished erasing the tracks. He knew such a project, one that required the fabrication of geology, would have demanded the expertise of someone who specialized in geophysical deception, someone whose career might have been destroyed by the weight of the secret. Seamless retention bridge, soft cliffhanger. The next logical step was to look not forward into the burgeoning suburbs of the 1950s, but backward into the shattered, paranoid history of the late 1940s. Elias realized that the key to understanding the present deception lay in the tragic story of the first cartographer who had gone looking for the secret map hidden in the American earth. The search would lead him out of the neat lines of the USGS building and toward a state institution tucked away in the quiet, forgotten hills of Maryland, a place where the truth was kept not in a vault, but in the ruined mind of a man named Alistair. His map was unfinished and his sanity had paid the final elevation cost. He was institutionalized a decade ago, and Elias Vance was going to find him. The air in the records annex down 3 flights from Elias's usual station was cold and dry, smelling sharply of ozone and old mica sheets. It was the smell of forgotten facts, of histories too trivial or too sensitive to remain on the main floors. Elias Vance moved through the narrow aisles of steel filing cabinets with the unnatural, silent grace of a man on a sacred errand. The files here were not categorized by geography, but by date of termination, the official moment the government declared a project resolved, defunct, or simply non-existent. His goal was the drawer labeled 1946, 1947, Geodetic Auxiliary Studies closed. This was the delicate period, the brittle seam between the end of World War II and the official start of the Cold War, a time when desperate technology was given ambiguous names and housed in innocuous offices. He felt the cold, gritty texture of the steel handle under his fingers, pulling the drawer open with a quiet scraping sound that seemed loud in the absolute silence. He was searching for a shadow, a paper ghost known only by a passing phrase from a frightened, institutionalized man. Project Cypress Point. The files inside were yellowed and brittle, bound with cracking twine. They contained thousands of records on mundane topics, soil quality reports for new Army training grounds, the feasibility of using local quarry rock for new federal buildings. Elias scanned the headings, his eyes trained for the slightest irregularity, the phrase that felt too specific for its context. The psychological undercurrent here was profound. The conspiracy was hidden not by encryption, but by overwhelming boredom. The sheer volume of harmless data was the perfect camouflage. He worked slowly, methodically, respecting the paper, turning each sheet with the care of an archaeologist. He spent an hour on a series of memos regarding the transportation logistics of Portland cement, a tedious distraction designed to make any future auditor's eyes glaze over. But at the bottom of the 10th file, underneath the receipt for 3 tons of aggregate, he found it. A thin, single sheet of heavy bond paper, visibly newer than the surrounding documents, yet filed with them. It was a routing slip. It had been crumpled and then meticulously ironed flat, leaving permanent, pale creases across the surface. The slip bore the stamped header of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, a jarring presence in a USGS drawer. The routing list was short, passing through 3 names he didn't recognize, and concluding with a signature that gave him a physical jolt. D.H., the initials of his colleague, David Hale. The date was 1948, 3 years before the Rock Creek anomaly appeared on the surface. Next to the final box, which indicated destination action, someone, likely David, had scrawled a single, Frantic word and pencil before heavily erasing it. Terminate. Micro hook. Revelation of a shared past. Elias felt the cool stillness of the room shift into something suffocating. This was not a current betrayal. This was a foundational one. David Hale wasn't merely correcting data in 1951. He had been involved in closing down the original project in 1948. This meant the anomalies Elias was tracking were not new errors, but the lingering structural evidence of something that was supposed to have been completely, utterly eradicated. The conspiracy had roots running deeper than Elias had imagined, extending back to the very first moments of the Cold War security apparatus. David Hale wasn't just a functionary. He was a gatekeeper protecting a 3-year-old skeleton. He continued searching, driven by a new focused intensity. If the project had been terminated, there would have been a final report, a cleanup order, a record of the ultimate disposition of the assets. He searched the adjacent boxes, moving into the geological anomalies section, a box that should have been empty, but was surprisingly full of mundane reports about minor fault lines near old railway tunnels. And then at the very back, he found a folded manila envelope sealed with heavy, official wax. The seal cracked and clearly broken years ago. Inside the envelope were remnants. Not a full document, but thick paper scraps that had been shredded, then clumsily taped back together with strips of cheap yellowed cellophane tape. It was a desperate job, performed by someone who needed to read the forbidden information but lacked the resources to properly reconstruct it. This was an act of historical vandalism he was now benefiting from. The psychological effect of holding those patched, fragile fragments was powerful. This was tangible proof that someone else, years ago, had felt the same terrifying urge to defy the official record. He laid the scraps out on the cold steel drawer top, fitting them together like pieces of a terrifying puzzle. Most were just headings and introductory paragraphs, but together they formed a fractured, chilling title block. Document 47 AEC 9993. B title, Project Cypress Point Geo-Psychological Infrastructure Status. Critical Classified Phase 3 Objective. To establish the viability of using large-scale, low-frequency sound resonators embedded in residential foundations. To test behavioral compliance under persistent, subliminal stress. Focus areas. Suburban D.C. Corridor, 1948. Psychological reveal. The weaponization of home. The phrase geo-psychological infrastructure seemed to vibrate off the brittle paper. The quiet perfection of the American suburbs was not merely a cover for underground facilities. It was the facility itself. The perfect symmetry, the identical designs, the inexplicable elevations. These were architectural components of a vast, decentralized experiment designed to subtly, constantly affect the minds of the people living there. It triggered the core American fear. The home, the last bastion of privacy and safety, was secretly infiltrated and weaponized by the very government sworn to protect it. Elias stared at the phrase behavioral compliance. It wasn't about spying for secrets. It was about engineering obedience. They weren't hiding weapons. They were hiding the mechanism for controlling the national mood. The 6-inch elevation hiccup on the map, the one David Hale had so casually corrected, was likely the structural signature of a resonator cavity designed to propagate the subliminal sound waves. The geometry of the suburban development was a massive, silent acoustic map. A cold bead of sweat traced a line down Elias's temple. The official name Cypress Point suddenly made a horrific kind of sense. A cypress tree is known for its incredible durability and its deep, stubborn root system. The project was meant to be deeply rooted, resilient, and utterly invisible. And David Hale, the man who smiled gently and sharpened his pencil to a fine point, was one of the original gardeners of those routes. He hastily gathered the shredded document, folding it carefully inside his coat pocket. He couldn't leave it here. The risk was too high, especially since David Hale's signature confirmed his long-term involvement. Elias knew that if he were to be discovered now, they wouldn't just erase the evidence, they would erase the witness. The fear was now physical, a tight knot of dread that contrasted violently with the meticulous calm he forced upon his hands. He had found the name and with it the motive, but he was still missing the final, definitive evidence, the detailed engineering specs that proved how the suburbs were built to lie. Seamless retention bridge, soft cliffhanger. Elias had one last piece of the fragmented document. It was a partial routing instruction for the engineering schematics. It didn't list a department but a name, a man who would have demanded absolute precision in the construction of the invisible, the chief architect who drafted the suburbs that defied physics. The name was scrawled on the yellowed tape, a single looping signature that led directly out of the government bureaucracy and into the terrifying world of the civilian contractors. And that name would take him right to the architects of false comfort. The cartographer's tools, when handled correctly, never lied. The transit, heavy and immovable on its tripod, measured angles of the world with almost cosmic certainty. The level, with its silent bubble trapped beneath glass, confirmed the horizontal plane with absolute loyalty. Elias Vance treated these instruments with a reverence bordering on religious devotion, for they were the only true priests in the temple of objective fact. They were supposed to grant him peace, but on the afternoon he discovered the second elevation. They only granted him the first cold tremor of doubt. It was a barely perceptible error, a fractional discord that existed only where the pencil met the vellum. In the Rock Creek sector, near the newly paved road of Magnolia Crescent, the published field data indicated the land rose smoothly from 145 feet to 152 feet above sea level, over a span of 500 yards. Elias had charted this climb dozens of times, meticulously drawing the concentric contour lines that defined the slope. He used a sharp 4H lead, leaving faint, dry lines on the thick paper, lines that should have been the final word on the landscape's shape. But when he superimposed the raw, non-digital data from the oldest field survey, a fragile 1949 reading that predated the official development, a ghost appeared. It was a hairline contour, a single lonely line that suggested a localized 2-foot rise and fall that existed within the larger 7-foot ascent. This tiny transient bulge defied the geology of the area. It was an anomaly so small, it could be dismissed by any honest surveyor as a calibration error, a tremor in the earth that had since settled. But for Elias, it was an offense against the sacred geometry of the map. He ran his fingers over the vellum, feeling the smooth, unbroken surface. There was no physical feature on the property to explain the contour. The land was now smoothly graded for the lawns of the new homes, yet the ghost line insisted on its existence, whispering of a past elevation that should not have been there. It was a subtractive anomaly, a part of the map that had been quietly, systematically removed. Elias began to obsess over the 2-foot discrepancy. He took the original raw numbers and recalculated the trigonometric relationship, using only the star charts and the angle of the sun recorded on the original survey day. He trusted the heavens more than the engineers. The result remained the same. The second elevation existed. It was mathematically real but geographically absent. It was the moment his orderly world began to tilt, introducing the frightening possibility that the error was not in the field, but in the system. Microhook, the contradiction of beauty. The sheer perfection of the suburban architecture suddenly felt sinister. These houses, with their symmetrical windows and identical mailboxes, were meant to soothe the anxious American psyche after years of war and uncertainty. But the ghost line ran directly under the concrete slab foundation of a single, unassuming home on Magnolia Crescent, the very picture of domestic bliss. The line intersected the exact center of the house, slicing right through the utility room and the master bedroom closet. It was the physical address of the deception. The map suggested that this home was built not on the natural earth, but over a sudden intentional swell and drop in the grade. And the question that coiled in Elias's mind was terrifyingly simple. Why build a secret ridge only to bury it? His obsession became an isolating devotion. He stopped taking his full lunch break, preferring the quiet company of his drawing instruments. The rhythmic scratching of his pen across the paper, once a comfort, now sounded like frantic digging. He began examining the blueprints not for the home's architectural soundness but for their intentional failings. He found that every home in the Patriot Crest development adhered to a nearly identical, but slightly altered foundation plan. The footings were always deeper than necessary, the slab unusually thick, and the utility conduit access points placed in extremely specific, non-standard locations, always precisely aligned with the ghost contour. He started compiling his own internal, unauthorized map, the anomalous grid. He used a distinctive red graphite pencil, marking every spot where the ghost contour appeared across the Rock Creek sector. The pattern that emerged was less like random geological chance and more like a massive, hidden wiring diagram. The anomalies were not isolated. They were connected, creating a subtle geometric network that spanned nearly a square mile of quiet suburban streets. The suburbs were not a collection of houses. They were a giant, diffused machine. Psychological reveal, the cartographer's burden. The psychological undercurrent shifted from simple suspicion to a profound sense of betrayal of profession. Elias felt like an unwilling participant in an unprecedented crime against truth. Cartography is an act of trust. The citizen trusts the mapmaker to tell them where the line is. If the mapmaker actively obscures the landscape, then the underlying social contract dissolves. The very land upon which American security and prosperity was founded was now revealed to be fundamentally unstable, literally resting on a lie. Elias began experiencing a subtle, persistent vertigo, the feeling that the ground under his feet was shifting. Even when he was seated at his desk, he needed an explanation, a historical precedent for such massive-scale geological fakery. He searched the archives for any Cold War project, military, scientific, or infrastructure, that required the creation of controlled, subterranean acoustic or vibrational fields. Nothing. The records were pristine, sterile, and aggressively boring. It confirmed his suspicion. The silence was the sound of the operation. He finally drove back to the house on Magnolia Crescent, not as a surveyor, but as a frightened neighbor. He sat in his car, watching the routine rhythm of the home. A man watering the lawn, a woman hanging laundry, the simple, honest sounds of family life. He saw the children playing near the basement window, right above where his red pencil had drawn the ghost elevation. The thought that their safety, their peace, their very perception of reality might be engineered by invisible, low-frequency pressure from the concealed structure beneath their slab was crushing. The terror of Project Cypress Point wasn't the secret itself. It was the intimate proximity of the secret to the most vulnerable members of society. Seamless retention bridge, soft cliffhanger. Elias had confirmed the existence of the second elevation. He knew it was engineered and he knew it was systemic, but to prove it he needed to find the original design brief. the document that detailed why the ground had to be reshaped. He needed a document that survived the systematic purging orchestrated by David Hale. He recalled a fragile, shredded memo he'd seen earlier, tucked away in the archives, mentioning a specific, defunct geological study that predated the suburban construction boom. The title had been nearly illegible, but the name of the project was still there, like a faint scar on the history of the nation. It was the whisper of a terrifying explanation that connected a single, impossible contour line to the highest levels of government secrecy. It was the whisper of Project Cypress Point. The world of Washington bureaucracy operated on the principle of the shell, layers of anonymity designed to absorb and deflect any inquiry before it reached the core of the power structure. For Elias Vance, the transition from the pristine mathematical certainty of the USGS basement to the dizzying complexity of corporate records felt like wading through thick, obfuscating fog. The air in the city clerk's office was heavy and hot, smelling of stale cigar smoke and the metallic tang of old registration stamps. This was where money went to hide and where the most ambitious secrets were born under the most innocuous letterheads. Elias was hunting a name, Patriot Crest Developments. It was the construction firm responsible for the Rock Creek sector, the houses built precisely over the second elevation anomaly. The name sounded reassuringly American, solid and utterly bland, the perfect mask. He was operating on a single, fragile clue recovered from the shredded Project Cypress Point memo. A partial routing slip that indicated the schematics had been transferred directly to the company's chief architect. The pursuit was now shifting from finding a secret document to finding a secret collaborator. He opened the massive, bound ledger listing corporate registrations for the 1940s and 50s. The pages were thin, yellowed rice paper dry to the touch, and the typeface was small, listing thousands of small, forgotten businesses. Patriot Crest Developments appeared on page 412, filed in early 1948. Its registration was brief and elegantly simple, listing a single registered agent and a post office box in Alexandria, Virginia. There were no listed directors, no major shareholders, and no prior history of construction projects. It was a company that seemed to have sprung, fully formed, for the sole purpose of building this one suburban tract. This lack of complexity was, ironically, the loudest alarm bell. Real estate in the D.C. area was a venomous tangle of familial connections and political favors. A company that appeared with this level of pristine simplicity was not simple at all. It was sanitized. It suggested a deliberate creation, a perfectly clean vessel designed to hold a single dirty purpose. The psychological profile of a shell corporation is one of pure evasion, an entity designed to promise comfort while serving surveillance. The name Patriot Crest now sounded less like a marketing slogan and more like a cold, government directive. Elias tracked the registered agent, a man named Jerome Finch. The address listed was a small, dusty legal office above a laundromat, a classic dead drop for a paper ghost. He went to the address, finding only a closed door and a handwritten sign that read Finch Legal Services, gone to retirement. He felt the familiar dread creeping up, the realization that the moment he found a tangible lead, the lead vanished, perfectly anticipating his inquiry by weeks, months, or even years. The architects of false comfort were silent and their builders were ghosts. Microhook, the texture of deception. He returned to the city records, focusing on Finch's other listed clients. This was the cartographer's way of finding a boundary. If he couldn't measure the object directly, he would measure the space around it. He found dozens of small, obscure holding groups, but one name stood out because of its stark, almost brutal anonymity. The Quadrant Trust. The name was cold, mathematical and abstract, devoid of any reassuring Americana. The Quadrant Trust was the holding company that owned the land before Patriot Crest purchased it, and it was the holding company that held the mortgages after the homes were sold. It was the constant, the immovable axis around which the entire deception rotated. Elias stared at the listing, feeling the brittle, sharp edge of the paper cut into his finger. The Quadrant Trust had only one listed asset, a single large warehouse lot on the desolate industrial edge of Silver Spring, Maryland. A warehouse, the perfect, unremarkable storage space for the massive, proprietary equipment required to manipulate the Earth's elevation. The thought brought him a chilling clarity. The deception wasn't just topographical, it was industrial. It required massive machinery, deep trenches, and silent, round-the-clock construction. The quiet suburban houses were merely the decorative roof over a highly complex, secret engineering site. Psychological reveal. The cold logic of power. The true terror of this revelation was not in the technical specs, but in the cold logic of power. The government hadn't just built a system of psychological stress, they had monetized it. They had sold the very homes that contained the experiment to unsuspecting American families, using the profits to fund the ongoing infrastructure of the lie. The suburbs were not only a test site for compliance, they were a self-sustaining financial engine for the conspiracy. This level of cynical efficiency, blending patriotism, commerce, and psychological manipulation, was far more disturbing than any pulp spy story. It was the complete weaponization of the American dream. Elias had to find the architect, the individual who translated the terrifying geo-psychological brief into concrete, measurable blueprints. He returned to the shredded Project Cypress Point memo in his coat pocket, gently pulling out the piece of tape with the final, loopy signature that Finch had seemingly routed the schematics to. It took him hours of agonizing cross-referencing through old professional society listings, tracing the handwriting itself, until he finally found a match in the dusty archives of the American Institute of Architects. The signature belonged to Cassian Lowe. Cassian Lowe was a man of quiet, unremarkable genius, specializing in prefabricated construction methods during the war, a logical choice for a high-volume, repetitive build like the Rock Creek sector. Lowe had vanished from public record in 1950, just after the Patriot Crest development was completed. His professional trajectory simply flatlined, another ghost consumed by the quiet perfection of the Cold War machine. Elias realized that Lowe was the most vulnerable link. He wasn't a surveyor like David Hale, paid to erase the truth, or a faceless lawyer like Finch, paid to hide the paper. Lowe was a creator, a man whose work existed in physical reality. He was the one who knew exactly where the resonator cavities were poured, how the conduits were wired, and how the ghost elevation was structurally integrated. An architect's compulsion is to leave an indelible, honest record of their creation. Elias surmised that Lowe would have left a counter map, a private, secret key hidden within his public works. The only way to find Lowe's secret inventory was to find his private office, his sanctuary, the one place he wouldn't sanitize. The professional listings pointed to a long-closed private studio in an aging loft building in Georgetown, a space that, unlike the lawyer's office, was likely to have been simply forgotten, left to molder, its secrets preserved by bureaucratic indifference rather than ruthless efficiency. Seamless retention bridge, soft cliffhanger. Elias had moved past the bureaucratic curtain and located the man who built the lie.
His next step wasn't toward a government office, but toward a dilapidated, echoing studio filled with dust and shadow. He knew that Cassian Lowe, the architect of false comfort, would have had to make a choice when he disappeared: submit to the erasure, or secretly leave behind a testament to his own corruption. The truth of the how, the geometric constants, the precise elevation of the buried resonators was waiting for Elias, etched onto a forgotten drawing board. And he had to find it before the silent builders decided to finally silence the studio. The loft studio of Cassian Lowe, the vanished architect, was a cavern of stale air and settled dust high above the cobbled streets of Georgetown. The floorboards groaned with the dry, complaining sound of disuse, and the single massive skylight filtered the afternoon sun into long, dusty shafts, illuminating the residue of obsession. The space smelled of turpentine, old coffee grounds, and the sweet, lingering scent of drafting linen, the smell of intense, solitary creation abandoned mid-thought. Elias Vance stood in the center of the room, feeling the immediate weight of a sympathetic tragedy. This was not the sterile environment of the government archive. This was the intimate ruin of a man who had confronted the very lie Elias was chasing. The furniture was minimal: a single worn leather chair, a stack of empty coffee cups, and the centerpiece, a massive, tilting drafting table, its surface scratched and covered in the faint, ghostly outlines of previous designs. Elias approached the table, feeling the rough texture of the unfinished wooden edge. He knew that for an architect, the drawing board is sacred, a place where the chaotic demands of the world are translated into the obedient certainty of geometry. Cassian Lowe, tasked with translating the terrifying brief of Project Cypress Point into buildable homes, must have suffered his own crisis of conscience. He had built the lie. Surely he had left a secret record of the truth. Elias's own hands were steady, guided by the cold certainty of his purpose. He ignored the piles of residential sketches and mundane office correspondence scattered across the floor. He was looking for what a professional hides: the raw data, the first drafts, the things that were too technically honest to survive the final corporate sanitization. He found a locked wooden flat file cabinet in the corner, heavy and defiant. With a few deliberate movements, using a thin, brittle steel ruler as a pick, a tool of precision turned into a tool of entry, Elias bypassed the cheap lock. The sound was a quick, sharp click that seemed absorbed instantly by the dust-heavy air. Inside were Lowe's most private papers, not the final blueprints, but the preliminary geodetic surveys, the topographical readings taken before the bulldozers arrived. They were meticulous, covered with Lowe's dense, disciplined handwriting, and dated 1947. These notes confirmed Elias's suspicions instantly. The raw land in the Rock Creek sector was naturally level, boring, and utterly lacking the subtle, 2-foot rise that now defined the anomalies. The second elevation was not geological, it was pure architectural fiat. But the true prize was a loose sheet of onion skin tracing paper, taped haphazardly to a faded aerial photograph of the future development site. This was Lowe's confession. On it, in vibrant blue ink, were complex, repetitive equations and engineering constants. These weren't standard construction figures, they were formulas related to acoustics and resonant frequency. Lowe had transcribed the technical specifications of the geo-psychological infrastructure directly onto the map. Elias stared at the equations. They defined the precise dimensions and material requirements for the resonator cavities, the very structures buried under the suburban lawns that created the low-frequency field. He recognized the mathematical constant phi, the golden ratio, used to calculate the ideal shape for maximizing the resonance within the concrete foundation slabs. The architects of Project Cypress Point weren't just building houses, they were building perfect, repeating sound chambers, turning the suburbs into a vast, silent instrument of social control. The very geometry of the American home was a weapon. The realization brought a sudden wave of nausea. Elias clutched the edge of the drafting table, the rough wood pressing into his palm. This was the moment where the quiet, intellectual dread turned into active physical paranoia. He wasn't just investigating a map anomaly, he was staring at the operating manual for a national psychological experiment. Lowe's drawing detailed how the concrete foundation slab itself, the supposed basis of the American family's security, was poured with a specific blend of aggregate and rebar placement for maximizing the propagation of the subaural tone. The frequency was listed: 18.9 Hz, a tone just below the threshold of human hearing, known scientifically to induce feelings of anxiety, restlessness, and vague dread. The goal was not control through fear, but control through induced neurosis, a permanent, low-grade, internalized panic. Elias had always found peace in the objective truth of measurement. Now his own tools, the principles of geodesy and geometry, were revealed to be the language of the conspiracy. His entire life was founded on a discipline that had been co-opted and weaponized. This was the geodesy of paranoia, the use of perfect, indisputable mathematics to create an environment where the citizens are perpetually unsettled, subtly pushed toward compliance by an anxiety they cannot name or locate. This kind of betrayal was uniquely American, a secret hidden within the very foundation of the nation's promise. He lifted a stack of discarded drafting papers, and underneath he found Lowe's most prized possession, a magnificent antique brass planer bar, exactly like his own, a beautiful, solid, handheld tool for measuring area on a map. But Lowe's bar was different. Etched into the brass side, in faint, nearly invisible script, were a series of coordinates. They were not for the Rock Creek sector. They were coordinates for a location outside the D.C. area, a remote, high-altitude military reserve in New Mexico. Elias realized this was Lowe's final desperate truth. The resonator blueprints proved the how of the suburbs, but the coordinates pointed to the source, the central transmission point, the high-powered, long-range facility that generated the original 18.9 Hz tone and broadcast it across the American landscape, using the engineered suburban foundation slabs as decentralized antenna. Lowe, knowing he was being erased, had entrusted the secret not to a document, but to the very tool of his trade, the most reliable object in his possession. The physical, hand-drawn map had failed, but the metallic certainty of the instrument itself became the final key. He slid the onion skin paper and the coordinates into his briefcase, the smell of turpentine and old paper clinging to his clothes. He had the truth. The suburbs were a machine, and he knew how the machine worked. But in the quiet isolation of the derelict studio, a single chilling thought surfaced. If Cassian Lowe, the brilliant architect, was forced to run, what chance did Elias Vance, the quiet cartographer, have against a machine built on perfect geometry and absolute obedience? Elias was now holding the coordinates for the main transmitter, the hidden heart of the conspiracy. But he knew that the moment he used this information, the subtle pressure he felt, the low, constant hum of the system, would turn aggressive. He needed an ally who existed outside the government's jurisdiction, who could understand the mathematical language of the threat. The coordinates were useless unless he could interpret them with the clarity of someone who had seen this deception before. He knew one man who fit that description, the forgotten surveyor from the 1940s whose career ended in a breakdown when he too found the truth in a ghost line. He had the blueprints for the lie, but the asylum held the missing witness who knew the fail-safe. The suburban lawn of 1951 was a deliberate act of psychological assurance, a perfect emerald green statement of domestic order, a soft, yielding surface that suggested nothing hostile lay beneath. The air above the lawns was meant to smell of cut grass and normalcy, but Elias now knew the truth. The soft, quiet lawns of the Rock Creek sector were the thin, decorative skin over a perfectly concealed, hard infrastructure designed to broadcast silent anxiety. Armed with Cassian Lowe's stolen schematics, the onion skin tracings, and acoustic constants, Elias was no longer guessing, he was seeing. The suburbs had become transparent to him, revealing their hidden, frightening geometry. The conduits, the pipes, the utility access points, the mundane fixtures that should connect the house to the municipal system, were in fact the visible parts of the invisible machine. They were conduits to nowhere, drawing current and carrying noise, but leading to no public, accountable destination. On a cool, overcast Sunday morning, a day when the neighborhood was filled with the soft, innocuous sounds of sprinklers and distant church bells, Elias returned to Magnolia Crescent. He was wearing heavy, working man's clothes, carrying a thick, unmarked toolbox and a simple analog magnetic field detector, a device so old it wouldn't be recorded or recognized by any current government monitoring system. He wasn't there to survey the land, he was there to inventory the lie. He started at the edge of the property line where the official power entered the house.
The thick black conduit running into the ground was standard, but Lowe's blueprint showed a secondary, parallel conduit, slightly wider and buried exactly 2 feet deeper. This second pipe was designated only by a cryptic AEC-04 marker on the schematics. Elias knelt, pressing the magnetic field detector against the damp earth just above where the AEC-04 conduit should run. The instrument, a simple dial and needle, usually rested peacefully at 0. Now the needle began to chatter nervously, spiking gently with a repetitive rhythmic pulse that perfectly matched the 18.9 Hz frequency listed on Lowe's formulas. The realization settled deep in his chest, heavy and cold. The low hum he had felt, the sleepless drone of the suburbs, was not metaphor. It was real, an electrical signature of power being continuously drawn down into the earth to energize the hidden resonator cavity. The electricity wasn't just lighting the home, it was vibrating the home. Elias moved to the utility closet outside the house, the standard access point for water and gas meters. He ran his hand over the painted concrete surface. It felt unusually thick. According to the architect's confession, the utility closet was built directly atop the main acoustic junction box, where the low-frequency electrical current was converted into mechanical vibration and introduced into the foundation slab. He pressed his detector against the wall. The needle swung violently, reaching its maximum deflection. The concrete was alive with silent energy. The genius of the deception, Elias realized, lay in its perfect loop of plausibility. If a homeowner felt anxious, stressed, or paranoid, the known effects of prolonged exposure to subaural frequencies, they would naturally look for physical comfort within their safe home. They would turn on the lights, run the bath, or simply stand by the window and look out at the order of their perfect lawn. But every part of that comfort was built into the machine. The electrical infrastructure caused the anxiety, and the suburban ideal was designed to mask the source. The system was designed to make the victim blame themselves for the feeling of perpetual low-grade dread. He pulled out the onion skin tracing and compared it to the geometry of the house itself. The windows, the central hallway, the placement of the heating vents, they were all positioned not for efficiency, but for acoustic channeling. Lowe had built the perfect echo chamber, designed to trap and amplify the silent vibration, ensuring the 18.9 Hz tone saturated the internal atmosphere of the home. It triggered the chilling, core American anxiety. The system you pay for is actively working against you.
David didn't look at the maps. He looked directly into Elias's eyes, offering not a threat, but a plea for surrender. David then offered the casual comment that froze Elias's blood. "I remember when you started," David murmured, stirring his coffee. "You were just like Alistair, obsessed with the 6 inches. Too much precision can be unhealthy, Elias. We map what we are told is there. That's the job." Alistair, the name of the missing institutionalized cartographer, introduced casually into the conversation. It was a perfectly pitched warning, not an accusation of treason, but a diagnosis of future madness. The exchange revealed the profound psychological rift between the two men. Elias was consumed by the burden of unspoken truth, the necessity of validating the scientific principles they had both sworn to uphold. David, conversely, was consumed by the burden of perfect obedience, the belief that the preservation of the system, even if founded on a lie, was the higher virtue. David's betrayal was not fueled by malice, but a chilling form of corporate patriotism, the willingness to sacrifice individual truth for institutional security. He had paid the price of silence in 1948, and now he was trying to protect Elias from the same terrible cost. Elias had already found the photographic proof of the resonator cavities. He knew the coordinates of the transmitter. He needed to push David, not for a confession, but for the system's internal logic. Later that night, Elias returned to his desk after hours, carrying a single powerful light source and a can of specialized chemical developer used for revealing older, faded ink. He poured the developer onto a section of the vellum where David had made a recent, heavy erasure over a set of coordinates. The chemical reacted, revealing the dark, ghostly residue of the original numbers David had tried to destroy. The original numbers confirmed the precise location of the transmitter coordinates given on Cassian Lowe's planar bar. David had not corrected the error, he had merely buried the truth deeper. But under those numbers, faintly visible after a second application of the developer, were a series of 5 short cryptic letters: F, A, I, L, S. These letters were David's final, almost subliminal communication, a desperate mark of his own fear, etched into the map before he was forced to erase it. It was a warning that the system contained a failsafe, a hidden mechanism for total self-destruction or maximum damage if the operation was compromised. Elias had been warned, not by an enemy, but a desperate friend. David's ghost message confirmed the conspiracy's dangerous fragility. The system that monitored the suburbs and controlled the national mood was not stable. It had an internal weakness, a single point of failure that could be triggered if the truth were exposed. The betrayal on the drafting table had given Elias not only the proof of the cover-up, but a hint of the ultimate danger. David's warning was the final push he needed to seek out Alistair, the man who had been driven mad by the 6 inches obsession, the only person who might know the exact mathematical constant needed to safely engage that terrifying failsafe. The darkness in the suburbs was never absolute. It was a soft, porous blanket woven with the faint glow of streetlights and the scattered porch lamps left burning against the quiet paranoia of the night. On Maplewood Lane, the air was cool and still, but under the quiet surface of the night, Elias Vance could now sense a vast synthetic energy at work. The stillness was a lie. The quiet was a mask for noise, a noise felt not with the ear, but with the subtle, deep pressure of the bone. Elias sat in his car, parked 3 streets away from the epicenter of the Rock Creek sector, armed with Cassian Lowe's acoustic formulas and a modified, highly sensitive seismometer, a tool meant for measuring earthquakes, now repurposed to detect the silent terror of a suburban resonance field. He was mapping not the geography, but the atmosphere, charting the density of anxiety itself. The seismometer was a delicate instrument, its needle resting on a tiny, hair-thin wire. It was calibrated to register frequencies below 20 Hz, the infrasound range, tones too low for the human ear to perceive, but perfectly capable of rattling the human body and mind. Scientific studies dismissed these tones as natural phenomena, distant wind, ocean waves, or heavy industrial machinery. But Lowe's schematics proved that in this suburb, the source was deliberate, engineered, and sustained. Elias watched the needle. It should have remained still, save for the occasional tremor from a passing car. But even in the dead silence of 2 a.m., the needle quivered, settling into a continuous shallow oscillation between 18.5 and 19.3 Hz. This was the signature of the low hum, the invisible, sleepless drone that saturated the homes built by Patriot Crest. It was the sound of Project Cypress Point working, relentlessly, silently through the night. The feeling it induced was not pain, but a generalized ambient dread. It was the sensation of being perpetually watched, of impending doom that never resolves. He felt it in the tight muscles of his jaw, the faint internal flutter in his diaphragm. The purpose of this tone was insidious, to slowly, systematically erode the residents' sense of psychological safety, making them pliable, easily distracted, and perfectly compliant to the external order of the Cold War state. They were testing the boundaries of American resilience, using their own homes as the laboratory. He began to drive slowly through the affected streets, using the seismometer as a divining rod. The needle jumped highest not over the buried electrical conduits, but over the front sidewalks and driveways. Lowe's plans had revealed the secret. The concrete slabs used for the civilian infrastructure, the very pathways where children played, were poured with a specific type of aggregate that maximized vibration conductivity. The sidewalks were not merely for walking, they were transmitting surfaces, turning every square foot of the suburban landscape into a part of the acoustic weapon. The physical closeness of the residents to these surfaces maximized the exposure. Elias pulled over near a perfectly manicured lawn framed by a low, whitewashed wooden fence. He placed the seismometer carefully on the ground. The readings were spiking. He then placed the instrument on the wooden fence post. The reading dropped dramatically. The wood, organic and natural, absorbed the vibration. The concrete, synthetic and engineered, conducted it. The subtle design choice, the preference for vast uninterrupted concrete slabs over natural materials, was not aesthetic, it was acoustic strategy. He realized the sinister implication for the American sense of security. The fence, traditionally a symbol of private property and boundary, had been visually maintained, but acoustically neutralized. The true invisible fence was the infrasound boundary surrounding the entire neighborhood, keeping the residents in a state of controlled psychological pressure. The low hum was the invisible picket fence of the Cold War. The longer Elias stayed in the field, the deeper the psychological effect became. The continuous silent energy began to blur the line between external threat and internal paranoia. He wondered if his growing anxiety was a rational response to finding a massive conspiracy or merely the expected, engineered result of the 18.9 Hz tone saturating his brain. This was the ultimate terror of Project Cypress Point. It forced the victim to question the validity of their own distress. Was his fear real, or was it just the frequency making him afraid? He thought back to David Hale's perfect calm, the placid smile of a man who had chosen to accept the lie. David had achieved compliance. His mind had assimilated the low hum into his baseline reality, mistaking engineered anxiety for normal life. Elias, the surveyor, was fighting not the conspiracy, but the internal pressure to submit to the false reality. His obsession with the 6 inches of error was his mind's last stand for objective truth against the constant overwhelming flood of psychological suggestion. He drove to the single schoolhouse in the Rock Creek sector, an older brick building that stood slightly outside the Patriot Crest development zone. He measured the ground there. The needle settled back to a perfect, peaceful 0. The difference was stark, audible only to the seismometer. The children in the new suburban homes were sleeping under a blanket of engineered anxiety, while the children just a few blocks away were sleeping under the shelter of actual silence. The choice of who was included in the experiment and who was spared spoke volumes about the cold, targeted intent of the conspiracy. Elias drove back towards his own neighborhood, the familiar dread returning as the seismometer needle began to twitch again. He found himself performing the same meaningless, repetitive actions that David Hale had performed, constantly checking his briefcase, running his hand over his keys, confirming that the doors were locked. Small, unnecessary rituals of safety. The low hum had already found a purchase in his own subconscious. He had become one of the test subjects. Elias had mapped the frequency, the physical structure, and the psychological impact of the sleepless suburb. He knew the low hum was real and intentional. But the schematics from Cassian Low only provided the input frequency, 18.9 Hz. They didn't provide the output, the frequency required to create destructive resonance, the sound,
and neutralize the infrastructure. He needed the mathematical key to disarm the project, a formula capable of calculating the exact counter frequency. David Hale had warned him, referencing the fragile, institutionalized surveyor, Alistair, the man whose madness was born of a number. Elias knew that Alistair was the only one who could provide the final necessary constant, the key that could turn the suburb's weapon against itself. The grounds of the state asylum were vast and silent, rolling hills of uncut grass fading into a cold November mist. The air here was dramatically different from the city, clean, crisp, and heavy with the scent of pine and decay. The immense sprawling brick structure stood against the horizon, built in an era when mental illness was addressed with architecture meant to impose order and isolation. The walls were thick, absorbing sound, creating a silence so profound it felt less peaceful and more oppressive. Elias Vance drove his sedan slowly up the winding, private lane. He had navigated government secrets, corporate shell games, and the silent betrayal of a friend. Now he was seeking the most fragile, dangerous truth of all, the truth locked inside the mind of a man named Alistair Finch, no relation to the shell company lawyer Jerome Finch, though the similarity in names was a cold coincidence that did not escape Elias. Alistair was the surveyor whose career and sanity had imploded in 1947, just as Project Cypress Point was beginning its work. He was the first cartographer to see the ghost lines, the first to pay the price for the 6-inch obsession. Elias checked his briefcase. Inside were the blueprints, the photographs of the resonator cavities, and the coordinates for the transmitter. The asylum represented the conspiracy's ultimate failsafe, the power to take a dangerous truth and render it harmless by classifying the teller as mad. If Elias was caught, this was his planned destination. He felt a deep, chilling solidarity with the missing witness he was about to meet. He presented his forged credentials, a meticulously crafted transfer order from the Department of Housing and Urban Development requesting an assessment of historical land claim records. The head nurse, a woman whose face was worn by decades of observing human despair, barely glanced at the paper. She led him through halls that echoed with the shuffling sound of felt slippers on polished linoleum, the walls painted a dull antiseptic green. The cold was pervasive, seeping up from the floor. Alistair Finch was housed in a low-security day room, a space filled with weak winter light and the faint restless murmur of men perpetually displaced from reality. Alistair Finch himself was seated by a window, thin and gray, his hands clasped tightly over a worn, pocket-sized ledger. He looked less like a patient and more like a monk dedicated to a single, endless calculation. His gaze was distant, fixed on a world that only he could perceive. Elias sat across from him. The silence was thick and awkward. The air smelled of institutional soap and the deep, chemical sadness of enforced quiet. Elias spoke softly, using the language only a surveyor would understand, the language of measurement and certainty. "Alistair," he began, his voice low, "I'm looking for the true bearing of the D.C. meridian. I have a problem with the elevation in the Rock Creek sector. There's a ghost contour, a 6-inch discrepancy that the final map won't acknowledge." At the sound of 6-inch discrepancy, Alistair's eyes snapped into sudden terrifying focus. They were bright blue, clear, and absolutely panicked. He did not look at Elias. He looked through him, focusing on something distant in the room. His hands tightened on the ledger. Microhook, the code in the riddle. 6, Alistair whispered, his voice dry and raspy, like old parchment rubbing together. 6 is the denominator, always the denominator, the divisor of the perfect lie. They built the world to be seen in 6-foot increments, but the truth lives in the fraction. He pulled his hands apart, revealing the leather-bound ledger. It wasn't a diary. It was a book filled with endless rows of numbers, written in a cramped, precise hand. A surveyor's code. Elias produced the photograph of the resonator cavity, the one showing the subtle metal shunts embedded in the concrete. Alistair glanced at the photo for a split second, and his breath hitched, the reaction of a man seeing the physical proof of his nightmare. "The shunts," Alistair murmured, tapping the photo with a thin finger. "They vibrate the foundations. They want the people to be restless, always restless." He traced a line in the air. "The frequency is bad, Elias. It's the wrong number, the wrong tone." Elias took out the onion skin tracing with Lowe's formula, pointing to the 18.9 Hertz figure. "This is the input frequency, Alistair. I need the counter frequency, the one that creates destructive interference, the one that will shatter the acoustic field." He needed the mathematical key that David Hale had warned him about.
Alistair shook his head slowly, a profound sorrow settling back into his gaze. You can't fight fire with fire, Elias. That's what they want. The failsafe is not destructive, it's negating. You must introduce the factor they eliminated, the one that forces the map to tell the truth again. He tapped the ledger again. It's the constant of the unseen. Psychological reveal, the weaponized number. Alistair explained in fractured poetic language the genesis of Project Cypress Point. He had been working on the original land surveys for the Manhattan Project's decommissioning sites. He discovered that the government was attempting to use prime number geometry in construction to introduce acoustic fields that affected psychological states. When the Manhattan Project closed, the technology was repurposed, moving from nuclear physics to social physics, using the principles of mass and wave propagation to control the national temperament. Alistair found the error in their formula, a specific irrational number that, when factored into the geometry, neutralized the field, forcing the projected vibration to cancel itself out. The system's architects had purposely eliminated this number, the constant of the unseen, from all official schematics, including Lowe's blueprints. Alistair opened his ledger to a specific page. The page was covered with a single, repeating, beautifully complex number. He drew a line under it. This is what they tried to erase, Elias. The true denominator. It creates the acoustic null. It forces silence. The number was irrational, endless, defying the smooth, clean logic of the Cold War engineers. It was the mathematical symbol of chaos used to defeat perfect engineered order. The constant was the anti-frequency he needed to calculate the final countertone. He was holding the key to dismantling the sleepless suburb. The moment he finished writing the number, Alistair's intensity vanished. His eyes softened, growing distant again. He looked back out the window at the pine trees. It goes to New Mexico, Elias. The signal. It needs a high altitude, the desert air. He had confirmed the coordinates found on Lowe's planar bar. The asylum and the missing witness had yielded its truth. Elias rose, knowing he had everything he needed: the proof of the crime, the location of the power source, and the constant of the unseen, the numerical key to the system's defeat. He thanked Alistair, but the old surveyor was already lost in the quiet fields of his own mind. As Elias walked toward the door, Alistair spoke one last time, his voice a chilling echo of the danger ahead. The true cost, Elias, is the pen. You have the number, but they have the ink. The tracer is already on your desk. The warning was cold, absolute, and utterly terrifying. The cartographer's home office, usually a sanctuary of measured calm, had become an emergency laboratory. The air was thick with the faint metallic scent of heated wiring and the dry, sweet smell of old paper. The Elias Vance drawing table, the very table David Hale had betrayed, lay the collected evidence of the conspiracy. The blueprints from the vanished architect, the coordinates from the antique planar bar, and the irrational constant transcribed from the asylum ledger. This number, scribbled in Alistair's manic, precise hand, was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Elias had not given the number a name when he copied it from the missing witness, but as he began to work, translating the constant into a practical, actionable formula, he realized it would forever be associated with the man who fought the lie with objective truth. It would be his legacy, his silent weapon. He called it simply the Vance constant. The task was formidable. He had two key pieces of data: the input frequency of the psychological drone, 18.9 Hz, from Lowe's schematics, and the Vance constant, the irrational number meant to be factored into the acoustic geometry to create a null field. His goal was not revenge, but cancellation. He needed to calculate the exact frequency that, when introduced into the system, would achieve destructive interference, a perfect mirror wave that would crash into the low hum and silence the suburbs without destroying the infrastructure. He used his oldest tools, preferring the silent, tactile surety of his slide rule and logarithmic tables over the new, untrustworthy electronic calculators used by the USGS. The wood and brass felt honest against his hands. He was fighting a digital lie with analog truth. The formula Lowe had provided for the resonator geometry was complex, involving variables for concrete density, rebar spacing, and soil composition. It was a cold, efficient calculation of how to turn geology into a weapon. Elias had to insert Alistair's irrational number, the factor of natural disorder, into the equation. The Vance constant, represented here as G sub c, geometric constant, was the missing piece. It was the mathematical key that proved the system was fundamentally flawed, designed to fail unless this one number was eliminated. The calculation was beautiful in its precision, a poetic confrontation between order and chaos. The numbers flowed from his slide rule, revealing a complex, precise relationship. The Vance constant acted as an impedance factor, disrupting the clean, simple mathematics of the architects. Every time Elias rechecked a step, running his finger along the cold, metallic tongue of the slide rule, the result stabilized, converging on a single, clear counter-frequency. The number wasn't arbitrary. It was the perfect mathematical mirror of the anxiety drone. As the dawn began to filter through the windows, gray and uncertain, Elias arrived at the final figure, the low hum, the constant 18.9 hertz that vibrated the concrete foundations of the suburban dream could be completely neutralized by introducing a secondary tone at 18.784 hertz. The difference was minute, separated by barely 1/10 of a hertz, but in the world of wave physics, that tiny fraction represented the difference between perpetual anxiety and absolute silence. This was the frequency that would perfectly oppose the conspiracy signature, crashing the waves together and creating an acoustic null, a zone of genuine, unengineered peace. He etched the number onto a spare piece of vellum with his sharpest pencil, the lines dry and perfect. The sight of the answer brought a strange, heavy sense of finality, not triumph. He now held the power to disrupt the massive, self-sustaining system of psychological control. He had the mathematical weapon, but using it required a final, terrifying step, physically transmitting this counter-frequency, this Vance tone, directly into the core of the infrastructure. The psychological undercurrent shifted from paranoia to the crushing burden of unique knowledge. Elias was no longer fighting for his own sanity. He was fighting on behalf of millions of unsuspecting Americans whose sense of reality had been quietly compromised. He felt the immense weight of the system, the collective power of the government agencies, the corporate shells, and the silent, obedient functionaries like David Hale, all of whom would instantly converge on the single point of disruption. He knew that the very act of calculating this counter-frequency had likely registered somewhere, somehow. The system, built on constant vigilance, would be aware of the attempt before the tone was even broadcast. He turned his attention to the coordinates from the planar bar, the high-altitude desert location in New Mexico. This was the source, the central broadcast nexus that generated the low hum and distributed the signal across the nation, using the engineered suburbs as receivers. The New Mexico site was a decommissioned military research base, a desolate patch of sand and rock, now functioning as the silent, beating heart of Project Cypress Point. Elias had to get the Vance tone to that transmitter, but he was a cartographer, not a radio engineer, and he was currently operating under the radar of the most powerful security apparatus in the country. He needed help. He needed a vehicle that could carry his truth across state lines, a platform that could broadcast his calculated number to the only audience that mattered, the machine itself. He realized the simplest, most beautifully subversive method was the one least expected by the intelligence community. He wouldn't use classified radio frequencies or encrypted lines. He would use the most common, most benign platform of the era, the public telephone system, coded through the meticulous language of his own profession. Elias took out a clean sheet of paper and began writing a short, cryptic message, a series of numbers that, interpreted using the trigonometric ciphers of an outdated USGS codebook, would translate the New Mexico coordinates, the 18.784 Hz counter-frequency, and the location of the Rock Creek anomalies. He had to send this message to the single person he could trust implicitly, the one person whose life was already intertwined with the suburban lie, yet remained outside the government's immediate jurisdiction: his wife, Alice. But as he reached for the pen, Alistair's final chilling warning echoed in his mind. The true cost, Elias, is the pen. The tracer is already on your desk. The pen he used every day, the ink he trusted, was secretly compromised by David Hale. Elias had the mathematical key, but the simple, physical act of writing the message might be the one step that alerts the system and seals his fate. The home on Magnolia Crescent looked, smelled, and felt like every other house in the Rock Creek sector. It had the reassuring, dusty scent of new paint and treated lumber, the soft texture of a newly laid, thick concrete slab foundation, and the quiet promise of stability. Yet, according to Elias Vance's true map, this house was an impossible object. It sat precisely at the geographical apex of the second elevation anomaly, and the ground it rested on was mathematically defined as existing in two places at once. For Elias, this was the null point, the place where the architectural lie was the most dense. He visited the home on a dark evening, using the pretext of a municipal water pressure inspection. The young family who lived there, the unwitting test subjects, greeted him with the weary politeness of people already suffering from the vague, internal restlessness induced by the low hum. Their living room was tidy, but the atmosphere was brittle, humming with a tension that felt manufactured. Elias moved slowly, his heart beating a low, heavy rhythm against his ribs, every movement an act of deception. He needed access to the basement utility closet, the point where Cassian Lowe's blueprints showed the main acoustic junction box was buried. He shined his flashlight into the closet, the beam cutting through the damp, musty smell of the confined space. He ran his hand along the interior foundation wall. The concrete felt cold, solid, and utterly featureless. This was the conspiracy's genius. The hidden infrastructure was not a tunnel or a vault. It was simply more foundation, poured thicker, deeper, and more anonymously than anyone would ever question. Using a small handheld radar unit, a bulky device smuggled out of the USGS archives, he began to scan the floor of the closet. The unit was designed to map subsurface density variations, searching for fissures, metal, or voids. The radar beam penetrated the thick concrete. The screen should have shown a solid, uninterrupted field of dense earth and rock beneath the house. Instead, the image that blossomed on the small glowing green screen was terrifyingly simple. Directly beneath the center of the house, starting just 2 feet below the surface of the slab, was a massive, dark crescent shape, spanning almost 20 feet across. It was a region of absolute void. The house was not resting on earth, it was resting on a cavity. The low hum was being generated from a massive engineered space directly underneath the children's bedrooms. The cavity was not a natural sinkhole. The walls of the void were perfectly smooth and curved, matching the acoustic reflector shape detailed in Lowe's advanced schematics. The second elevation, the 6-inch anomaly, wasn't an upward swell of earth, but the crowned roof of this hidden space. It was designed to push the foundation slab up slightly, creating the optimal geometry for wave propagation. The house was not a safe harbor. It was a giant, finely tuned drum skin stretched over an empty space to maximize the 18.9 Hz drone. Elias pressed his ear against the cold concrete floor. He could hear the faint high-frequency sound of the house's legitimate systems, the water heater clicking, the electrical meter humming, but under it all he felt the heavy, resonant pulse of the cavity below, a sound that was less audible and more like the pressure of deep water. The fear that gripped him was not of falling, but of silence, the chilling thought that the house was being vibrated from a subterranean space that was entirely empty of human presence. He had to get closer to the void. He located a metal inspection plate recessed into the floor.
He pried it open with a flat screwdriver. The sound of the metal scraping against the concrete seemed deafening in the quiet utility closet. He peered down into the opening. He could see the dark, curved wall of the resonator cavity, a flawless concrete arch that vanished into darkness 30 feet below the floor. He aimed his small industrial camera down the hole, taking flash photographs. When the pictures developed later, they revealed a chilling sight. The massive concrete walls of the cavity were entirely smooth except for a single, repeating feature: a network of heavy copper wire bundles emerging from the concrete floor and running vertically up the cavity wall, terminating abruptly in the roof of the chamber.
These were not power lines. They were acoustic dampening filaments designed to absorb high-frequency sounds, ensuring that the 18.9 Hz drone was the only sound that reached the foundation slab above. They were meticulously built for absolute silence within the void itself, preserving the low hum's perfect, singular tone. The revelation of the cavity inverted Elias's entire psychological understanding of the lie. The betrayal wasn't horizontal, the falsification of the surrounding land. It was vertical, the fundamental corruption of the very ground beneath the American family's feet. The terror of the empty cavity was the fear of uncontrolled depth and the knowledge that the system had built its infrastructure of psychological control right where the citizen felt safest, under the family room rug. Elias knew he couldn't leave the house without a physical piece of the evidence. He located a small, thick cable emerging from the floor near the sewage pipe, a cable that the low schematics identified as the primary low-frequency current injector. He carefully, silently, used a heavy wire cutter to snip a 4-inch section of the cable. The copper felt cold and strangely dry. It was the physical proof that the house was wired not for comfort, but for control. As he moved to replace the inspection plate, the wife of the homeowner suddenly appeared in the doorway, drawn by the faint scratching sound of the metal. Her face was drawn, her eyes wide with that familiar, underlying anxiety. She offered a quick, forced smile. "Everything all right, Inspector?" she asked, her voice tight. "The water pressure has been a little off lately. Everything just feels shaky." Elias looked at her, seeing the low hum's victim, a woman whose intuition was telling her the truth, but whose engineered environment was forcing her to attribute it to a faulty utility. He held the snipped piece of cable tightly in his pocket, the heat of the copper mingling with his own body heat. "The pressure is fine, ma'am," Elias lied smoothly, sealing the inspection plate back into the floor. "Just a minor fluctuation in the municipal grid. Nothing to worry about. Go back to sleep." He had just looked into the darkness under her house and told her to embrace the deception. The heavy, sick weight of that lie was the new burden of the cartographer. Elias had confirmed the cavity and obtained a segment of the control cable, physical proof that the house was never meant to be a home, but an acoustic instrument. He had the input frequency, 18.9 Hz, the counter constant, Alistair's irrational number, and the final key, 18.784 Hz, that would shatter the field. But Alistair's warning still echoed. "They have the ink. The tracer is already on your desk." His entire investigative trail, from the shredded memo to the mathematical calculation, had been recorded by David Hale's hidden surveillance system. He knew the system was waiting for the final, physical act of communication to stop him. He had to alert his wife Alice and initiate the counter-broadcast, but he could not use his usual pen, for the simple act of writing the counter-frequency might be the only final mistake he was allowed to make. The cartographer's pen is the final witness. It is the tool that commits the fleeting, complicated truth of the physical world onto the cold permanence of paper. For Elias Vance, his favorite fountain pen, a heavy brass model gifted by his wife Alice, had always been an extension of his own meticulous mind, honest, precise, and utterly reliable. Now, sitting alone under the quiet scrutiny of his desk lamp, Alistair's final ragged warning echoed like a death knell. "They have the ink.
The tracer is already on your desk. The air in the room was warm and close, smelling of burnt coffee and the faint chemical residue of the photographic fixer Elias had used to reveal the hidden cavity under the suburban home. He had the complete truth, the low hums frequency, the transmitter's coordinates, the Vance constant, and the physical proof of the acoustic cavities. He had the key to silencing the sleepless suburb. All he had to do was write, but the pen lay on his desk like a small, silent weapon. Finally, he tapped the ultimate answer, the 18.784 Hz counter frequency. For this, he held the key down, generating a single continuous tone that lasted precisely 18.784 seconds. As he tapped the sequences, he simultaneously flashed a strong, focused beam of light over the film. The tones he generated were translated into a coded sequence of light exposure onto the film's emulsion. The coordinates, the constant, and the counter frequency were not recorded in ink. They were recorded in shadow and light. The message was a physical wave pattern captured on a chemical substrate, completely invisible to the ferrofluid tracer and the magnetic sensor awaiting the written word. He carefully rolled the exposed film and placed it into a small, familiar aluminum canister, the same kind Alice used for her own work. He had one final, terrifying task: getting the film to his wife without David Hale intercepting him. He wrote a single, non-incriminating note using a simple lead pencil, not the tracer pen. Alice, develop film 4, use the salt bath. The salt bath was their private code referring to a specific chemical development process that would invert the tones from light patterns back into numbers. Elias Vance stood alone in his office, the aluminum canister cool and heavy in his hand, containing the acoustic null that could silence the suburbs. He had outsmarted the tracer, bypassing the system that relied on his professional habit. But his final note, the innocent pencil scratch, still had to leave the office, and he knew David Hale was no longer waiting in the next room. David was outside, waiting for the one moment Elias left his desk. He had the truth secured, but the simple physical journey to the front door was the last, most dangerous map he had to navigate. He knew the system was waiting for the final, physical act of communication to stop him. He had to alert his wife Alice and initiate the counter broadcast. But the very hallway outside his office was now the first line of the conspiracy's defense.